On my 67th birthday, my only son sent me a bottle of imported Russian vodka as a gift. The next morning, he called to ask if I had poured myself a glass. I replied calmly that I had given it to my lawyer and that my lawyer found it absolutely fascinating. There was a long, suffocating pause on the line before my son screamed in sheer panic, demanding to know what I had done. He had no idea that his careless gift was the key I needed to legally obliterate his future. Before I explain exactly how this single bottle of liquor cost my son a $4 million inheritance, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an arrogant family member a devastating lesson in respect. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the delivery truck pulled into my driveway. I stood by the front window of my quiet suburban home watching the courier jog up the walkway, shielding a heavy rectangular package from the downpour. I opened the front door before he could knock. He handed me the parcel, asked for a signature, and hurried back to his truck. The box was surprisingly heavy. I carried it to the kitchen island and carefully sliced through the thick packing tape with a utility knife. Inside sat a pristine midnight blue velvet box. I unlatched the silver clasp and opened the lid. Resting perfectly in the custom-molded interior was a bottle of rare premium Russian vodka. The glass was frosted, the label ornate and entirely in Cyrillic. Tucked beside the neck of the bottle was a small, cream-colored envelope. I pulled the card out. The handwriting belonged to my son, Bradley. The message was brief, sharp, and entirely intentional. "Happy birthday, old man. It is time you stop living such a boring, sad life. Pour a glass, loosen up, and remember how to actually celebrate. Enjoy." I read the words 3 times. I did not scream. I did not throw the card across the room. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. I carefully lifted the heavy glass bottle from its velvet bed. It was cold to the touch. I carried it across the kitchen and placed it gently on the polished granite countertop. Right next to the bottle, I placed my heavy brass coin. The metal clinked softly against the stone. It was my Alcoholics Anonymous medallion. The engraving clearly stated 12 years of continuous, unbroken sobriety. Bradley knew exactly what that coin meant. He knew the hell I had crawled out of 12 years ago. He had watched me rebuild my life, my marriage to his late mother, and my hardware business from the ground up after alcohol nearly destroyed it all. Yet here he was, placing the exact instrument of my past destruction directly into my hands on my birthday. This was not a misguided joke. This was a calculated strike. I turned away from the bottle and walked to the kitchen sink. I turned on the faucet and let the water run cold. I reached into the upper cabinet and retrieved my small amber prescription bottle. I unscrewed the child-proof cap and tapped a single small, pale pill into the palm of my hand. Warfarin. It was a powerful blood thinner prescribed by my cardiologist after my mild heart attack 2 years ago. I placed the pill on my tongue, filled a glass with cold water, and swallowed the medication. My doctor had been explicitly clear about the rules of my survival. Alcohol thins the blood. Mixing high-proof vodka with my daily dose of warfarin would cause a catastrophic interaction. A single heavy night of drinking could trigger a fatal internal hemorrhage. Bradley knew about my heart condition. He knew about the medication. The intent behind the gift was becoming terrifyingly clear, but the legal motive was already burned into my memory. I left the kitchen and walked down the hallway to my home office. The room was dark, illuminated only by the gray light filtering through the rain-streaked window. I knelt in front of the heavy steel safe bolted to the floor in the corner of the room. I spun the combination dial. The heavy locking mechanism clicked, and I pulled the steel door open. I reached past the stacks of old tax returns and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. I carried it to my desk and switched on the brass reading lamp. I opened the folder to reveal the documents of my late wife, Patricia's irrevocable trust. When Patricia was diagnosed with terminal cancer 3 years ago, She wanted to ensure I was protected. She also knew the destructive potential of my past addiction. We worked with our lawyers to draft a very specific document to hold our $4 million estate, which included the house, the hardware business, and our liquid assets. I turned to page 14 and ran my finger under the bolded morality clause. The legal language was absolute. I was the primary beneficiary and sole trustee with full access to the wealth provided I maintained my sobriety. The clause stated that if I relapsed and consumed alcohol, I would be deemed unfit. In that exact event, control of the entire $4 million estate would instantly and permanently transfer to our only son, Bradley. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at Patricia's signature at the bottom of the page. Bradley was drowning in debt. I knew he had taken out reckless loans to fund his wife Megan's absurdly lavish lifestyle. They drove imported luxury cars they could not afford and took vacations to the Amalfi Coast while dodging creditors. Bradley needed a massive influx of cash to avoid bankruptcy. He could not wait for me to pass away naturally. He needed control of the trust right now. The bottle of vodka was not just an insult, it was a weapon. He was hoping my 12 years of discipline would crumble on a lonely birthday. He was hoping I would take a drink, violate the morality clause, and hand him the keys to the kingdom. He underestimated me entirely. He assumed my silence over his recent financial requests was a sign of weakness. He was about to learn that my silence was a strategy. I closed the leather folder and locked it back inside the safe. I returned to the kitchen. The bottle of Russian vodka sat exactly where I had left it, mocking me under the recessed lighting. I grabbed the bottle by the neck. I grabbed the birthday card. I walked to the hallway closet, pulled on my heavy wool coat, and grabbed my car keys. I marched out the front door and locked it behind me. The rain was falling harder now, pounding against the driveway. I got into my sedan, placed the bottle of vodka on the passenger seat, and started the engine. I did not call ahead. I put the car in drive and pulled out into the dark streets. The drive into the city took 45 minutes. The rhythmic sweeping of the windshield wipers was the only sound inside the cabin. Every time I hit a pothole, the heavy glass bottle shifted on the leather seat next to me. I glanced at it at every red light. To anyone else, it was an expensive gesture of celebration. To me, it was a loaded gun handed to a man with a target on his back. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had quietly given Bradley over the years to bail him out of bad investments. I thought about the way Megan rolled her eyes whenever I spoke at Thanksgiving dinner. I had tolerated their disrespect because I believed family required infinite patience. The bottle on the passenger seat shattered that illusion completely. Patience was over. It was time for absolute accountability. I pulled into the underground parking garage of a sleek, glass-fronted office building in the downtown financial district. I rode the elevator up to the 14th floor. The brass letters on the double glass doors read, "Pierce and Associates." It was past 8 in the evening, but I knew Stuart Pierce would still be at his desk. Stuart was the estate lawyer who had drafted Patricia's trust. He was sharp, relentless, and fiercely loyal to the exact letter of the law. I pushed open the glass doors and walked past the empty receptionist desk. I saw the light spilling out from Stuart's corner office at the end of the hallway. I walked into his office without knocking. Stuart looked up from a stack of legal briefs, pushing his tortoiseshell glasses up his nose. He looked surprised to see me standing there in a wet coat. Before he could offer a greeting, I walked directly to his heavy mahogany desk and set the bottle of vodka down with a solid thud. I placed the handwritten birthday card right beside it. Stuart stared at the bottle. He knew my history. He knew the terms of the trust. He looked up at me, his expression immediately shifting from confusion to deep professional concern. I stood tall, letting the cold anger radiate in my posture. I instructed Stuart to look at the gift. I told him my son sent it to me today. I told him to read the card. Stuart picked up the cream-colored envelope, pulled out the card, and read Bradley's mocking words. I watched Stuart's jaw tighten. He placed the card back on the desk. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute icy precision. I told Stewart that I was formally instructing him to document this event as a direct, premeditated attempt by an heir to induce a breach of fiduciary duty. I wanted a permanent legal record that Bradley Dawson had actively tried to trigger the morality clause of the irrevocable trust to seize the estate. I told Stewart I wanted this documented notarized and added to the official trust file immediately. Stewart nodded slowly. He understood the severity of the maneuver. He stood up from his leather chair, picked up the bottle of vodka by the base to avoid disturbing the neck, and picked up the card. He walked over to the heavy steel evidence safe built into his office wall. He punched in the security code, pulled the heavy door open, and placed the bottle and the card safely inside. He locked the safe and turned back to me. He assured me he would draft the incident report first thing in the morning. I thanked him, turned around, and walked out of the office. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for Bradley to call and ask if the bait had worked. The morning sun broke through the kitchen blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the granite island where the velvet box had sat just 12 hours earlier. I was already awake. I had been awake since 4 o'clock in the morning. I stood motionless by the stainless steel coffee maker, watching the dark, rich liquid slowly drip into my heavy ceramic mug. The entire house was completely silent, save for the steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the front hallway. I did not feel the usual morning stiffness in my joints today. I felt sharp. I felt completely alert and entirely focused. My mind was already calculating the legal ramifications of the trap he had tried to set. I knew the phone was going to ring. It was only a matter of when. Bradley was never an early riser, especially not on a weekday, but severe anxiety is a powerful alarm clock. He needed to know if his trap had snapped shut. He needed to know if he was suddenly a millionaire or if he remained a desperate man drowning in insurmountable debt. The tension in the air was palpable, heavy with the weight of his impending ruin. At exactly 8:15, the cellular phone resting on the kitchen counter began to vibrate violently against the stone surface. The screen illuminated brightly, displaying Bradley's smiling contact photo. It was an old picture taken 3 years ago, before the reckless loans, before the absolute financial desperation took hold of his life. I let the phone ring 3 full times. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, feeling the intense heat radiate through my chest. On the 4th ring, I picked up the device and slid my thumb across the smooth glass screen to accept the call. I brought the receiver to my ear and offered a simple, warm greeting. "Good morning, Bradley." His voice came through the tiny speaker, overly bright and forcefully cheerful. He asked how I was feeling this morning. He wished me a happy belated birthday once again, apologizing profusely for not being able to drop by the house the previous night. He blamed a sudden late meeting at his corporate office, a blatant lie we both knew I would normally accept without a single question. I played along perfectly. I told him I understood his busy schedule and thanked him sincerely for thinking of me on my special day. We danced around the true subject for exactly 2 minutes. He asked about the changing weather, pretending to care about the rainstorm that swept through the valley last night. He asked about the spring flowers in my garden, feigning interest in hobbies he usually openly mocked. Then the forced cheerfulness in his tone suddenly thinned out, replaced by a poorly concealed, breathless anticipation. "So, Dad," he began, his voice dropping half an octave as he attempted to sound casual, "I was wondering if you opened my gift last night. Did you try the vodka?" I did not answer him immediately. I let 2 full seconds of dead, heavy silence stretch across the cellular connection. Let him feel the suspense. Let his imagination run wild for just a moment before the axe fell. I looked out the kitchen window at the wet pavement of the driveway from last night's rainstorm. I took another slow sip of my hot coffee. When I finally spoke, my voice was completely devoid of any paternal warmth. It was flat cold and incredibly precise. "I gave it to my lawyer," I replied. "He loved it." The silence that followed those 8 words was absolute and terrifying. It was not the casual pause of someone processing a strange or unexpected statement. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a man who has just stepped off a high ledge in the pitch dark. I could clearly hear the faint, rapid sound of his breathing through the receiver. I could picture him perfectly standing in his lavishly decorated living room, the color completely draining from his face as the brutal reality of my statement crashed into his carefully constructed malicious plan. He realized instantly that his path to my wealth was now blocked by a massive legal wall. What Bradley finally managed to say. The word was barely a whisper. It was a pathetic, choked sound caught deep in his throat. I repeated myself, articulating each syllable with deliberate, unhurried care. I told him that I drove to Stuart Pierce's downtown office late last night. I explained that I handed the beautiful velvet box and the unopened bottle directly to my estate attorney. I added that Stuart found the extravagant gift to be an absolutely fascinating piece of physical evidence regarding the strict administration of the irrevocable trust. I made sure to emphasize the word evidence, letting it hang in the air between us like a drawn blade. "Dad." "What did you do?" Bradley shouted. The forced cheerfulness was entirely gone now. His voice was shrill, cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. I did not raise my voice in return. I remained perfectly still, leaning comfortably against the kitchen counter. I told him I simply took the necessary steps to protect my ongoing sobriety and my legal assets, just as the trust parameters explicitly required. I told him I found it highly inappropriate and legally suspicious for a primary heir to send a recovering alcoholic a direct trigger for a catastrophic relapse. "You gave it to Stuart?" Bradley stammered the words, tumbling over each other in a desperate, frantic rush. "Why would you do that? You were supposed to just keep it in the house. You were supposed to drink it or throw it away or just leave it hidden in the back of the liquor cabinet. Why would you involve the estate lawyers over a simple, harmless birthday present?" His logic was falling apart, exposing the desperate greed that drove his actions. His breathing grew significantly heavier and faster. He was visibly hyperventilating on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of his wife Megan's voice in the background, asking him what was wrong, demanding to know why he was suddenly yelling at the phone. Bradley ignored her completely. He was rapidly spiraling into total despair. He muttered something entirely incoherent about a terrible misunderstanding, about needing to drive over to my house to explain, about needing to fix this massive mistake immediately. "There is absolutely nothing to fix, Bradley," I stated with freezing finality. "The gift has been legally documented. The evidence safe is securely locked." I heard a loud, violent clatter through the small speaker, the distinct sound of an expensive smartphone slipping from sweaty fingers and smashing violently against a hardwood floor. A muffled, desperate curse echoed from the fallen device, followed immediately by the sharp, empty beep of the cellular call being abruptly disconnected. He had hung up in sheer terror, or he had dropped the phone and fled the room in blind panic. It did not matter to me. The dial tone hummed steadily and peacefully against my ear. I lowered the phone and placed it gently back on the granite kitchen counter. The heavy steel hook was now set deep in his jaw. The psychological torture had officially begun. I finished the rest of my black coffee, washed the ceramic mug carefully in the sink, and prepared my mind for the next devastating phase of the silent adjustment. Exactly 10 minutes passed since the abrupt and violent end to my phone call with my son. I remained in the kitchen during those 10 minutes. I did not move to turn on the television or pick up a newspaper. I simply stood by the granite island, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the clock in the hallway. The silence in the house was profound, but my mind was moving with absolute clarity. I anticipated the next phase of the conflict would begin shortly, perhaps with Bradley driving to my house in a blind panic to demand an explanation or to attempt to recover his lethal gift. I was fully prepared for a physical confrontation if he dared to show his face on my property. However, the next escalation did not come from my son. It came from my attorney. The cellular phone rested on the counter, its black screen reflecting the morning light. It vibrated suddenly, breaking the stillness of the room. The name Stuart Pierce appeared on the caller identification display. I felt a brief wave of surprise. It was highly unusual for Stuart to call this early in the morning unless there was a critical emergency regarding a client portfolio. I picked up the device and accepted the call, expecting him to ask a routine question about the incident report he was supposed to be drafting. Before I could even offer a standard morning greeting, Stuart began to speak. His voice lacked its usual polished, professional cadence. He was breathing erratically, taking short, sharp intakes of air, as if he had just sprinted up a flight of stairs. He did not sound like a high-powered estate attorney. He sounded completely terrified. He asked me if I was alone in the house and if all the doors were locked. I told him I was entirely alone and perfectly safe. I asked him to calm down and explain what was happening. Stuart took a deep breath and began to recount his morning. He explained that he had arrived at his downtown office at 6 o'clock, wanting to get an early start on drafting the formal documentation regarding the attempted trust violation. He opened his heavy steel wall safe and retrieved the velvet box containing the bottle of Russian vodka. He placed it on his large mahogany desk and turned on his bright fluorescent reading lamp to take official high-resolution photographs for the legal file. He wanted to document every single detail of the bottle, the packaging, and the handwritten card before sealing it permanently in an evidence bag. As he leaned in close to photograph the neck of the bottle under the intense light, he noticed an irregularity. The heavy paper tax stamp which stretches over the cap and down the neck to guarantee the product is untampered looked slightly misaligned. He pulled a magnifying glass from his desk drawer to inspect it further. Under magnification, the anomaly became undeniable. The paper stamp had a microscopic jagged tear along its edge. Furthermore, the clear plastic shrink wrap that secured the stamp to the glass was slightly clouded, lacking the flawless transparency of a factory machine seal. Stuart realized he was looking at a thin, almost invisible ridge of clear adhesive. The bottle had not come directly from a distributor or a luxury liquor store. The seal had been painstakingly removed, the bottle had been opened, and the entire packaging had been meticulously glued back together to simulate an untouched product. I listened to Stuart relay this information, feeling the cold knot in my stomach tighten into something much darker. A simple violation of a morality clause was a matter of greed. Opening and resealing a consumable liquid was a matter of deliberate, physical malice. Stuart continued his story, his voice still trembling slightly over the cellular connection. He explained that discovering a tampered asset in a high-stakes trust dispute completely changes the legal protocol. He could no longer simply document the bottle and file it away. He had to assume the contents were chemically altered. Stuart did not want to involve the local police department, immediately knowing that opening an official criminal investigation would completely freeze the administration of the trust and potentially tie up my assets in court for years. Instead, he relied on his private resources. Stuart retains a private investigator for complex corporate espionage cases, a former forensic specialist who operates a highly sophisticated independent laboratory. Stuart called this investigator immediately and demanded he come to the law firm with a mobile testing kit. The investigator arrived at the office 30 minutes later. Stuart watched as the man put on latex gloves, carefully sliced through the fraudulent glue line with a surgical scalpel, and removed the heavy glass stopper. The investigator used a sterile medical syringe to extract a small sample of the clear liquid from the center of the bottle. He placed the liquid into a series of small glass vials and prepared to run a rapid toxicology swab. Stuart explained that they were initially looking for common tampering agents, perhaps cheap rubbing alcohol or industrial solvents meant to cause severe illness and punish me for my sobriety. They were completely wrong. Stuart's breathing grew heavy again as he delivered the final devastating piece of information. The investigator added a specific chemical reagent to the sample. The clear liquid inside the testing vial instantly violently changed color, turning a dark, alarming shade of crimson. The investigator recognized the reaction immediately. He ran a secondary verification panel to be absolutely certain. The results were undeniable. The imported Russian vodka was not just altered, it was heavily lethally laced with massive concentrations of a medical-grade anticoagulant. Stewart paused, letting the silence hang over the phone line, ensuring I was fully comprehending the magnitude of his words. He told me the specific drug. It was warfarin. The name of the medication echoed in the quiet space of my kitchen. I looked involuntarily toward the cabinet, where my own small amber prescription bottle sat. The reality of my son's true intention crashed down upon me with the weight of a collapsing building. This was never about tempting me into a relapse so he could take my money through a legal loophole. The morality clause was just a convenient backup plan. The primary objective was my complete physical elimination. Stewart, recognizing my silence, began to explain the terrifying medical reality that the investigator had outlined for him. I was already taking a carefully monitored daily dose of warfarin to manage my heart condition. My blood was already chemically thinned to the exact threshold of safety. If I had opened that bottle last night to celebrate my birthday, if I had poured myself even a single standard measure of that tainted vodka, the results would have been irreversible. The massive concentrated dose of the drug hiding inside the alcohol would have overwhelmed my system entirely. Combined with my prescribed medication, my blood would have instantly lost all remaining ability to coagulate. I would not have felt any immediate pain. I would have simply gone to sleep. Within hours, a catastrophic internal hemorrhage would have occurred. I would have bled to death from the inside out alone in my bed. The sheer cold-blooded genius of the trap left me temporarily speechless. It was a flawless, virtually untraceable method of execution. Bradley had undoubtedly spent weeks researching drug interactions. He had somehow acquired a massive quantity of the prescription pills, likely through illicit means or by stealing them over time. He had crushed them into a fine powder, dissolved them completely into the high-proof alcohol, where they would be tasteless and invisible, and meticulously reconstructed the factory seal. If his plan had succeeded, my body would have been discovered the next morning. The medical examiner would have transported me to the county morgue for a standard autopsy. They would have run a routine toxicology screen and found high levels of warfarin in my bloodstream. They would have also found a significantly high blood alcohol content. The police would have walked into my kitchen, seen my 12-year sobriety medallion sitting next to an empty, expensive bottle of vodka, and they would have immediately closed the case. The official ruling would have been a tragic accidental overdose. The narrative would be simple and pathetic. A lonely, grieving widower unable to cope with another birthday alone finally breaks his sobriety. In his drunken, confused state, he accidentally takes far too many of his own heart pills and quietly passes away in his sleep. There would be no homicide investigation. There would be no suspicion of foul play. The local community would offer their condolences to my grieving son. The probate court would look at the official coroner's report, declare the morality clause violated, and my life extinguished, and immediately transfer the entire $4 million estate to Bradley without a single question asked. He had designed a murder that legally disguised itself as a suicide. Stewart's voice broke my train of thought. He asked me what I wanted to do. He stated that he had already locked the bottle back inside the evidence safe. He told me that we had enough physical proof to contact the federal authorities right now and have Bradley arrested for premeditated attempted murder. He pleaded with me to let him make the call to the police. I stood in my kitchen looking out the window at the morning sky. I felt a profound, chilling calmness wash over my entire body. The lingering, foolish hope that my son was simply misguided was completely eradicated. He was a predator who had smiled in my face while handing me a loaded weapon. A simple arrest was no longer sufficient. If he went to prison now, he would still have his wife, he would still have his hidden assets, and he would still believe he had almost outsmarted me. I needed to dismantle his entire existence. I needed to strip away every single resource he possessed before I delivered the final blow. I spoke into the phone, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. I ordered Stewart to maintain absolute silence. I expressly forbade him from contacting law enforcement or speaking a word of this to anyone outside his firm. I told him the time for lawyers and police would come soon enough, but right now I had to make a silent adjustment. I held the phone to my ear and listened to my attorney breathing heavily on the other end of the line. Stewart Pearce was a man of the law. He viewed the world through the rigid lens of statutes and criminal codes. To him, the discovery of the laced vodka was a matter for the authorities, a clear-cut case of attempted homicide that required immediate police intervention. He begged me again to let him call the district attorney. He insisted that we had the physical evidence, the chemical analysis, and the motive neatly wrapped up. I told him no. I told him that calling the police right now was the absolute worst action we could take. I explained my reasoning with cold, methodical precision. If we called the police today, Bradley would be arrested. He would be handcuffed and placed in a holding cell. That sounded like justice to a lawyer, but it did not sound like justice to me. Bradley would immediately invoke his right to remain silent. He would hire a ruthless criminal defense attorney using the very money he had systematically siphoned from my own accounts. His lawyer would argue that anyone could have tampered with that bottle in transit. They would introduce reasonable doubt. They would argue circumstantial evidence. The postal system is notoriously unsecure, they would claim. Bradley might even make bail within 48 hours. He would go home to his luxurious house, sit with his equally greedy wife, Megan, and prepare for a long, drawn-out legal battle. He would have the luxury of time to hide his remaining assets. He would have time to prepare his lies and coordinate his defense. I refused to give him that time. I refused to let him fight me on his own terms in a sterile courtroom. I wanted him completely dismantled before the police ever knocked on his door. I spoke into the receiver, my voice steady and commanding. I told Stewart that a simple arrest was far too good for a son who tries to assassinate his own father for a financial payout. Prison is a punishment for ordinary criminals, but I wanted total, absolute annihilation. I wanted him to lose his house, his cars, his marriage, and his dignity before he ever saw the inside of a jail cell. I wanted to trap him in a financial and psychological vice, tightening it slowly until his entire reality cracked and shattered under the immense pressure. I demanded that Stewart take the evidence bag containing the tampered bottle, place it inside the deepest part of his firm's secure vault, and forget it existed until I specifically gave him the signal. Stewart protested weakly, citing his ethical obligations as an officer of the court and his fear for my immediate safety. I reminded him that I was perfectly safe now that I knew exactly what my enemy was planning. I reminded him that I was his primary client. I was the sole trustee of the estate, and I was giving him a direct, legally binding order regarding my personal property. I assured him the federal authorities would be involved eventually, but only when I had personally orchestrated the perfect, inescapable climax. The trap had to close strictly on my schedule, not the schedule of the local police department. I needed to cut off all of Bradley's escape routes first. Stewart finally agreed, his voice tight with lingering anxiety and undeniable dread. He promised to keep the vault sealed and await my precise instructions. I thanked him for his discretion and ended the call. The pivot was complete. This was no longer a simple dispute over the parameters of an irrevocable trust. It was a silent, bloodless war of total destruction, and I was going to enjoy every single second of his ruin. I placed the cellular phone down on the cold granite countertop. The silence in the house felt entirely different now. It was no longer the quiet of a lonely morning. It was the calm before a devastating storm. I had survived addiction, I had survived the loss of my beloved wife, and I had survived a heart attack. I was certainly not going to be taken down by a coward who hid behind a counterfeit factory seal. I turned away from the kitchen window and walked down the long hallway toward my home office. My steps were measured and purposeful. The time for passive observation was over. The lockdown phase of my plan had to commence immediately. I needed to sever every single lifeline they currently possessed. I entered my home office and sat heavily behind my large oak desk. I reached out and powered on my desktop computer. The large monitor flickered to life, illuminating the dim room with a stark, pale glow. I opened my highly encrypted web browser and navigated directly to my state's digital legal registry. I carefully typed in my secure credentials and accessed my personal estate profile. Right at the top of the main dashboard was the medical power of attorney document I had authorized exactly 3 years ago, shortly after my mild heart attack. At the time, I truly believed it was the responsible fatherly thing to do. I believed my only son would make the right, compassionate choices if I were ever physically incapacitated or placed on life support. The bitter irony of that document was now suffocating. The man who currently held the absolute legal authority to end my medical treatment was the exact same man who had just attempted to chemically induce my death. I clicked on the active document profile. I navigated to the permanent revocation section. The digital system prompted me to confirm my identity with a secondary security code sent directly to my cellular phone. I retrieved the 6-digit code and typed the numbers into the keyboard without a single moment of hesitation. I moved my mouse and clicked the red button labeled Revoke All Medical Authority. A bright green confirmation banner flashed across the top of the screen. The legal severance was instantaneous. Just like that, Bradley was entirely stripped of any legal right to make medical or end-of-life decisions on my behalf. If I collapsed tomorrow, he would not even be legally permitted to enter my hospital room or speak to my attending physicians. Next, I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the commercial banking portal for my family hardware enterprise. I had built that company from a single struggling storefront into a massive regional supplier over 40 years of grueling, relentless work alongside my late wife, Patricia. We had sacrificed everything to build that wealth. I had foolishly allowed Bradley to have administrative access to the corporate accounts a few years ago under the naive guise of him learning the family business. He had immediately abused that generous privilege by adding his arrogant wife, Megan, as an authorized user on several high-limit corporate credit cards. I clicked deep into the account management dashboard. I pulled up the active user directory. Megan's name sat right there on the screen attached to a premium platinum card with a staggering $50,000 monthly spending limit. I pulled up her recent active transaction history. The screen instantly filled with exorbitant charges from luxury fashion boutiques, high-end day spas, and exclusive downtown restaurants. She was actively funding her entire shallow, pretentious existence on my sweat and blood. I highlighted her user profile. I did not simply lower her available spending limit or temporarily suspend the card. I selected the option for total, permanent administrative deletion. The banking system asked me to provide a formal reason for the immediate account closure. I typed the word fraud into the required text box and hit submit. Her financial access was instantly and permanently vaporized. I moved down the administrative list and found the secondary business lines of credit that Bradley routinely used to float his own failing personal investments. I locked every single one of them. I changed the primary administrative login passwords, instituted strict two-factor authentication, linked exclusively to my personal device, and froze all outgoing wire transfers pending my physical signature. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at the glowing monitor. The financial arteries were now completely clamped shut. By lunchtime today, their plastic cards would start declining all over the city. The silent adjustment had officially begun, and they were entirely unprepared for the sheer brutality of poverty. I needed an entirely different kind of professional to dissect the financial rot within my company. My regular corporate accountant was a good man, but he was accustomed to trusting the numbers presented to him. He looked for tax deductions, not criminal conspiracies. I needed a bloodhound. I reached out to a retired federal investigator named Wallace, a man who now ran a private financial forensics firm out of a highly secure office downtown. Wallace did not balance checkbooks. He hunted hidden assets and unraveled corporate embezzlement schemes for high-net-worth clients. I called his direct line, explained that I suspected severe internal fraud by a family member, and offered to pay double his standard emergency retainer for his immediate and exclusive attention. He arrived at my house less than 2 hours later, carrying a heavy encrypted laptop and an expression of absolute professional detachment. I led Wallace directly into my home office, bypassing the kitchen, where the phantom echo of the morning phone call still lingered. I closed the heavy oak door and locked it from the inside. I sat him down at my large desk, powered up my main terminal, and physically connected his encrypted machine directly to my secure home network. I logged into the primary administrative portal of my hardware company's master servers and granted Wallace total unrestricted access to 5 years of complete digital ledgers. I told him I wanted every single outgoing wire transfer, every corporate credit card swipe, and every vendor invoice scrutinized under a microscope. I wanted to know exactly how much blood my son had drained from the family business while smiling in my face. Wallace nodded once. He did not offer any false words of comfort. He simply cracked his knuckles, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and began to type with lightning speed. For the next 3 hours, the only sound in the room was the relentless rhythmic clicking of the keyboard and the low hum of the computer fans working overtime to process massive amounts of data. I sat in a leather armchair in the corner of the room, watching the sun slowly descend behind the trees outside the window, drinking a glass of cold water. I watched Wallace work. Forensic accounting is not simply about addition and subtraction. It is about understanding human behavior translated into numbers. It is about finding the shadows where the numbers deliberately do not align. Wallace was running complex algorithmic sweeps through thousands of individual transactions, searching for duplicated invoice numbers, off-cycle payment dates, and suspicious routing patterns. He was looking for the invisible strings Bradley had attached to my life's work. The tension in the room was suffocating. I knew the theft existed, but seeing it quantified was a completely different kind of pain. Suddenly, the rapid typing stopped. Wallace leaned closer to his screen, his eyes narrowing sharply as he focused on a specific column of numbers. He asked me to come over and look at the monitor. I stood behind his chair and stared at the complex spreadsheet he had isolated. He pointed a silver pen at a series of recurring payments made to a company called Apex Industrial Solutions. The payments were substantial, usually hitting the ledger on the second Tuesday of every month, ranging between $8,000 and $12,000 each time. The memo lines indicated these payments were for bulk orders of commercial-grade fasteners and heavy-duty sealants. Wallace asked me if Apex Industrial Solutions was a primary supplier for my hardware business. I looked at the name glowing on the monitor. In 40 years of running the company, I had never once authorized a single purchase order for a vendor by that name. I told him we purchased all our industrial fasteners directly from a dedicated manufacturer in Ohio, a company we had used exclusively since 1998. Wallace nodded, expecting that exact answer. He pressed a few keys, diving deeper into the banking metadata attached to the Apex vendor profile. Within seconds, he pulled up the corporate registration documents for the supposed supplier. Apex Industrial Solutions was not a sprawling manufacturing plant. It was a completely hollow limited liability company registered to a digital mail drop box in a neighboring state. It was a ghost vendor. Bradley had used his administrative access to create a fictitious supplier inside our payroll system. He had meticulously generated fake digital invoices for inventory that never actually existed and authorized the payments himself. The money was wired directly from my corporate operating accounts straight into the ghost vendor's bank account. It was textbook corporate embezzlement executed with an arrogant, sloppy confidence. But Apex was not the only one. Once Wallace knew the specific digital fingerprint of Bradley's fraud, he unleashed his software to hunt for identical patterns across the entire 5-year ledger. The screen began to populate with red flags. 3 more ghost vendors appeared in rapid succession. One claimed to provide warehouse maintenance services, Another supposedly handled targeted digital marketing, and the third billed us for non-existent corporate consulting fees. The total sum of the stolen money began to tally at the bottom of the screen, the numbers rolling upward like a slot machine in a nightmare. Wallace cross-referenced the outgoing wire transfers with the dates Bradley had been granted administrative privileges. The timeline matched flawlessly. The final calculated sum sat glaringly at the bottom of the spreadsheet. $314,000. My son had systematically robbed me of over $250,000 in just under 36 months. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering, but I needed to know exactly where the stolen funds had ultimately landed. Proving the money left my company was only the first half of the equation. I needed the final destination to complete the trap. Wallace traced the routing numbers from the 4 ghost vendor accounts. The money did not sit in those accounts for long. Within 24 hours of every fraudulent deposit, the funds were dispersed into a complex web of personal accounts. Wallace pulled up the final destination ledgers, and the truth of their lavish lifestyle was laid completely bare. The stolen hardware company funds were directly paying the massive mortgage on Bradley's suburban mansion. The money was covering the monthly lease payments on Megan's imported luxury vehicles. The most infuriating transactions were the personal indulgences. I saw tens of thousands of dollars wired directly to high-end travel agencies for their frequent European vacations. I saw massive payments to exclusive country clubs and luxury fashion boutiques, perfectly aligning with the exorbitant credit card bills I had reviewed earlier. Bradley had essentially turned my life's work into his own personal, unregulated, automated teller machine, financing a life of pure delusion while smiling at me across the Thanksgiving dinner table. He had stolen my money to build a kingdom of lies, and then he had sent me poison to ensure I could never ask for it back. Wallace turned to me, his face grim, and asked if I wanted him to compile the evidence into a formal legal dossier suitable for federal prosecution. I looked at the undeniable proof of their profound betrayal glowing on the monitor. The physical attempt on my life was hidden in a vault, and now the massive financial fraud was completely documented. I told Wallace to print every single page and place it into a thick, secure folder. The arsenal was rapidly growing, and I was entirely ready for the next phase of the operation. The drive up the winding mountain road took exactly 2 hours. I left the suffocating steel and glass of the city behind, trading the heavy afternoon traffic for the quiet, dense canopy of the northern pine forests. I needed the crisp, cold air. The forensic audit had completely exhausted my spirit, and I needed to touch something real, something grounded in honesty. My lakeside cabin was the only true sanctuary I had left in the world. I had purchased the remote 3-acre plot of land over 40 years ago, back when my hardware business was just a single, struggling storefront on a forgotten avenue. My late wife Patricia and I spent our precious weekends clearing the dense underbrush entirely by hand. We poured the heavy concrete foundation together, our hands covered in gray dust. We laid the massive cedar logs one by one, measuring and cutting each piece to build a quiet, unpretentious refuge far away from the relentless noise of the world. It was a sacred place holding decades of beautiful, untainted memories. It was completely untouched by the greed and the lies that had recently infected my life in the city. Or so I foolishly believed as I gripped the steering wheel. I turned my car off the main paved highway and onto the familiar narrow gravel access road that led directly down to the deep blue water. The thick, towering trees usually provided a tunnel of absolute meditative silence, but today the air was vibrating with a strange, unnatural hum. As I navigated the final sharp curve before the property line, my foot instinctively slammed down on the brake pedal. The loose gravel crunched loudly beneath my tires as the car came to a sudden sliding halt, leaving deep grooves in the dirt. I sat frozen behind the steering wheel, staring through the windshield, in absolute paralyzing disbelief. The quiet, undisturbed sanctuary I had built with my own 2 hands was completely gone. In its place was a sprawling, obnoxious spectacle of commercialized luxury. The large natural dirt clearing near the water where Patricia and I used to pitch a simple canvas tent was entirely paved over with temporary interlocking plastic floorboards. Parked haphazardly across my property were dozens of high-end imported vehicles. I saw sleek black sport utility vehicles with tinted windows, expensive European convertibles, and massive customized luxury passenger vans. The license plates were all from the wealthiest, most exclusive zip codes in the state. Beyond the absurd parking lot, the transformation of my property grew even more grotesque. A massive, pristine white canvas pavilion had been erected directly on the rocky shoreline, completely obstructing the natural, breathtaking view of the lake. Giant portable air conditioning units hummed loudly along the perimeter of the tent, aggressively battling the warm afternoon air and destroying the natural acoustics of the forest. I stepped out of my car, leaving the engine idling. The heavy, nostalgic scent of pine needles and fresh water had been completely erased, replaced by the cloying artificial smell of expensive floral incense and vaporized essential oils. Soft, rhythmic electronic music pulsed from hidden outdoor speakers, creating an irritating, manufactured atmosphere of false tranquility. I walked slowly toward the edge of the pavilion, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. Through the sheer white fabric of the tent, I could see dozens of people moving in unison. They were all dressed in matching skin-tight athletic wear, contorting their bodies on expensive, thick rubber mats. Standing at the very front of the pavilion, elevated on a small wooden stage with a wireless microphone headset strapped over her ear, was my daughter-in-law. Megan was in her absolute element. She was projecting her voice over the electronic music, guiding the wealthy attendees through their stretches, while casually adjusting her designer athletic top. I stood entirely still, taking in the full, disgusting scope of her audacity. She had not simply borrowed the family cabin for a quiet weekend getaway. She had completely commandeered my private property without a single word of permission and transformed it into a lucrative illegal commercial enterprise. She was running a highly promoted exclusive wellness retreat, charging these wealthy clients exorbitant fees to find inner peace on land she did not own, while actively plotting the demise of the man who legally held the deed. I did not attempt to hide behind the trees or retreat to my vehicle. I stood directly in the bright sunlight, a stark, glaring contrast to the perfectly curated artificial aesthetic of her fraudulent wellness retreat. I was wearing my faded denim work jeans, a simple plaid flannel shirt, and heavy leather work boots covered in thick dust from the gravel road. It took her less than a minute to notice me standing there, like a ghost from a reality she was trying to erase. She was mid-sentence instructing her wealthy clients to deeply inhale the ancient energy of the forest when her eyes locked onto mine across the clearing. She faltered instantly. The sensitive microphone picked up her sudden, sharp intake of breath. The manufactured, serene smile vanished from her face, replaced immediately by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic, which quickly morphed into deep, hateful annoyance. She quickly instructed the yoga class to hold their current pose and focus on their breathing. She ripped the wireless headset off her ear, tossed it onto a towel, and marched off the elevated wooden stage. She did not walk toward me with the warmth of family, or even the basic politeness of a guilty host. She marched across the manicured grass with the aggressive, highly entitled posture of a property manager dealing with an unwanted loitering trespasser. She stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me, crossing her arms tightly over her chest to create a physical barrier. She looked me up and down, her eyes full of profound, unconcealed disgust as she took in my simple, faded clothing. She did not offer a polite greeting or a stuttered apology. She immediately lowered her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper, demanding to know what on earth I was doing there, ruining her afternoon. She told me I was completely destroying the carefully constructed, high-end aesthetic of her premium retreat. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest and insulted my appearance without hesitation. She stated that I looked like a homeless vagrant wandering out of the woods and that my physical presence was deeply embarrassing her in front of extremely important, high-paying clients. She hissed that these people paid $5,000 a ticket for an exclusive, uninterrupted sanctuary experience not to look at a sad elderly man in dirty work boots loitering near the parking lot. I listened to her vicious insults without changing my expression or breaking eye contact. I looked past her shoulder at the massive white pavilion, the gleaming luxury cars, and the blatant, disrespectful destruction of my peaceful refuge. She followed my gaze and immediately doubled down on her staggering arrogance. She told me I had absolutely no legal right to show up unannounced and disrupt her business. She puffed out her chest and boldly claimed that since Bradley was going to inherit this useless piece of land very soon anyway, they were simply putting it to good use right now instead of letting it rot. She openly called it her future property. She demanded I turn around, get back into my dusty car, and drive back to the city immediately before I cost her a massive amount of money in refunded tickets and terrible online reviews. She told me to go home, lock my doors, and stay out of their sophisticated business affairs. She fully expected me to scream. She expected me to threaten her with the police or cause a massive, embarrassing public scene right in front of her wealthy clients. She desperately wanted a loud fight, so she could easily paint me as the crazy, unhinged old man who was losing his grip on reality. I gave her absolutely nothing. I looked directly into her cold, greedy eyes. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not demand she shut down the illegal commercial operation. I simply smiled. It was not a warm, forgiving smile. It was the calm, terrifyingly cold smile of a man who knows exactly how the story ends and holds all the cards. I gave her a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. I turned my back on her without speaking a single word, walked silently to my car, got inside and drove away, leaving her standing there in total confusion, completely unaware that her entire financial world was about to collapse. I closed the heavy steel door of my vehicle, instantly severing the pulse of the irritating electronic music and the sound of my daughter-in-law's shrill, commanding voice. The quiet interior of my car felt like a decompression chamber. I did not immediately start the engine. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the massive white canvas pavilion that had entirely consumed my sacred sanctuary. I felt a profound burning anger in my chest, but it was not the chaotic, blinding rage of a victim. It was the icy, calculated fury of an architect preparing for a controlled demolition. She believed this land was already hers. She believed she had successfully claimed my history and turned it into her personal playground. It was time to permanently disabuse her of that arrogant delusion. I reached into the breast pocket of my faded flannel shirt and retrieved my cellular phone. I scrolled past my regular contacts and navigated to a business directory I had not accessed in over 5 years. I found the number for a massive regional commercial land developer. The man who owned the firm, a ruthless corporate negotiator named Caldwell, had spent the better part of the last decade aggressively trying to purchase my lakeside property. He wanted to bulldoze the old growth pine trees, pave over the natural dirt paths, and construct a massive multi-story luxury resort, complete with a private marina. For 10 years, I had firmly and repeatedly rejected his incredibly lucrative offers, telling him the land was a family legacy and absolutely not for sale at any price. Today, the legacy was dead. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. Caldwell answered on the second ring, his voice booming with forced corporate cheerfulness. I did not waste a single breath on pleasantries or small talk. I spoke with absolute uncompromising authority. I told Caldwell that my circumstances had permanently changed and that the 3-acre lakeside parcel was officially on the market. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with sudden, greedy anticipation. Before he could launch into his standard aggressive negotiation tactics, I laid out my exact, non-negotiable terms. I told him I was willing to sell him the entire property, including the existing cabin structure and the deep water access rights for exactly 60% of the current market value. I was offering him a staggering, unprecedented discount that would guarantee him millions in immediate equity. Caldwell let out a low whistle of disbelief. He was a seasoned predator, and he immediately knew a distressed sale when he heard one. He cautiously asked what the catch was. I told him there were exactly two absolute conditions to this transaction. First, it had to be an entirely cash-funded purchase. I would not accept any bank financing contingencies, appraisal delays, or drawn-out corporate board approvals. Second, the entire legal transaction from the initial contract signing to the final transfer of the property deed had to be completed and filed with the county clerk in exactly 4 days. If the money was not sitting securely in my private bank account by noon on Friday, the deal was permanently off the table. Caldwell did not hesitate for more than 3 seconds. A 40% discount on prime waterfront real estate was a generational bargain. He eagerly agreed to every single term. He promised to have his team of corporate lawyers draft the expedited purchase agreement immediately and stated he would wire the non-refundable earnest money deposit into my escrow account before the banks closed today. I instructed him to send the final deed transfer documents directly to the office of my estate attorney, Stuart Pierce. I explicitly warned Caldwell to keep the transaction entirely confidential until the deed was officially recorded. I did not want a single rumor reaching the city before the ink was dry. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I looked out the windshield one last time at the pristine white pavilion and the wealthy clients twisting on their expensive rubber mats. I felt a brief, sharp pang of sorrow for the memories Patricia and I had built on this soil, but it was quickly washed away by the absolute necessity of the strike. By Friday afternoon, heavy industrial bulldozers would be rolling down this quiet gravel road. Megan's exclusive high-end wellness retreat was about to become an active construction zone, and she would have absolutely no legal standing to stop it. I turned the ignition key, shifted the car into drive, and drove back toward the city, leaving the doomed property behind in the dust. The psychological pressure I had applied during that brief morning phone call was working exactly as I had calculated. A cornered animal will always act out of sheer desperation, and Bradley was completely terrified. He knew I had handed the tampered bottle to my estate attorney, but he did not know exactly what Stuart and I had discovered regarding the poison. He likely assumed I was simply building a case for a standard trust violation. He needed to strike first to discredit me before I could legally move against him. He needed to control the narrative, and he chose the most vicious, humiliating legal route possible. It happened 2 days after my trip to the lake. I was sitting in my living room reading the morning newspaper when a heavy, aggressive knock rattled the front door. I set my reading glasses down on the side table and walked to the entryway. Standing on my front porch was a man in a cheap gray suit, holding a thick stack of legal documents enclosed in a heavy manila envelope. He asked to confirm my identity. When I nodded, he thrust the envelope directly into my chest, stated that I had been officially served, and walked quickly back to his parked car. I closed the door, walked back into the living room, and sat down on the sofa. I opened the envelope and pulled out the dense stack of legal filings. The header on the first page indicated it was an emergency petition filed in the county probate court. I began to read the sworn affidavits, and the sheer magnitude of my son's audacity was staggering. Bradley was officially suing for immediate involuntary medical guardianship over my person and my entire estate. He was legally petitioning the court to strip me of my fundamental civil rights, seize control of all my bank accounts, and force me into a locked psychiatric facility. The narrative he had constructed for the judge was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. In his sworn statement, Bradley claimed that I had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown following my recent birthday. He stated under penalty of perjury that I had violently relapsed into severe alcoholism after over a decade of sobriety. He painted a tragic, pathetic picture of an elderly man suffering from rapid onset dementia, wandering around a large, empty house in a drunken stupor. He claimed I was a profound danger to myself and an immediate threat to the financial stability of the family hardware business. The most enraging part of the document was the section of supposed physical evidence he had submitted to support his fabricated claims. Attached to the back of the petition was a photocopy of a retail receipt from an upscale liquor store located 3 towns over. The receipt showed the cash purchase of 1 bottle of imported Russian vodka, the exact brand currently locked inside my attorney's evidence vault. Bradley was actually attempting to claim that I had purchased the liquor myself in a desperate, sad attempt to break my own sobriety, and that his morning phone call was simply the worried check-in of a deeply concerned, loving son. He was twisting his own murder weapon into supposed proof of my insanity. I read through the proposed temporary orders. He had asked the presiding judge to instantly freeze all of my personal checking and savings accounts, claiming I was liable to squander the money in a drunken haze. He requested the immediate authority to change the locks on my house and take possession of my vehicles. He wanted total, absolute dominance over my existence. He was trying to execute a legal kidnapping using the probate court system as his personal weapon. Most men my age would have suffered a heart attack right there on the sofa. Most fathers would have broken down in tears, crushed by the overwhelming betrayal and the terrifying prospect of losing their freedom to a deceitful child. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel fear. I felt an immense, overwhelming sense of satisfaction. Bradley thought he was launching a brilliant preemptive strike to silence me. He did not realize he was just blindly sprinting into a minefield I had meticulously laid out for him. By filing these emergency guardianship papers, Bradley had officially sworn under oath that the fabricated events in the document were entirely true. He had committed flagrant perjury in a court of law. He had submitted falsified retail documents as physical evidence. He had elevated his crime from a private family dispute to a severe federal offense. When the time came to present the forensic audit and the toxicology report, the judge would not merely dismiss his petition. The judge would see a man who had attempted to use the judicial system to facilitate an assassination and a massive corporate theft. I placed the thick stack of court documents neatly on the coffee table. I picked up my cellular phone and dialed Stuart Pierce. When my attorney answered, his voice was still laced with the lingering anxiety from our previous conversation. I told him that Bradley had just served me with emergency guardianship papers and was claiming I was an incompetent, relapsed alcoholic. Stuart gasped immediately, understanding the severe legal danger of the situation. He frantically told me we needed to file an aggressive counter-petition immediately, that we needed to request an emergency hearing to present the evidence of the tampered bottle before a judge granted the temporary freeze on my assets. I stopped him mid-sentence. I told Stuart we were not going to fight the petition. I told him we were not going to file a single page of defense in the probate court. We were going to do exactly the opposite. We were going to let Bradley believe he had won. We were going to let him believe his legal trap had flawlessly snapped shut on my neck. I instructed Stuart to prepare a very specific set of legal documents for my signature documents that would willingly surrender the entire trust and grant Bradley exactly what he was demanding. The escalation had reached its absolute peak, and it was finally time to set the ultimate bait. The ambient lighting inside the exclusive downtown fashion boutique was perfectly calibrated to make every customer feel like absolute royalty. Megan stood gracefully at the polished white marble counter, admiring her reflection in the gilded mirrors. She had spent the past 2 hours casually browsing the imported seasonal collections, selecting 2 Italian leather handbags, a tailored silk trench coat, and 3 pairs of designer sunglasses. The sales associate, a young woman with an impeccably practiced smile, carefully folded the expensive garments into crisp tissue paper and placed them inside heavy embossed shopping bags. The grand total for the afternoon excursion came to $6,400. Megan did not even blink at the staggering number. She simply reached into her genuine crocodile skin purse and extracted her heavy platinum corporate credit card. She handed the metal card across the counter with the bored, careless elegance of a woman who had never actually earned a single dollar of the wealth she spent. The sales associate inserted the card into the digital payment terminal. Megan turned her attention back to her phone, already planning her dinner reservations for the evening. A sharp, flat electronic tone suddenly disrupted the quiet, luxurious atmosphere of the boutique. It was not the pleasant chime of an approved transaction. It was a harsh, undeniable rejection. The sales associate looked down at the terminal screen, her practiced smile faltering slightly. She politely informed Megan that the card had been declined and asked if she perhaps wanted to try a different method of payment. Megan let out a short, highly offended scoff. She snatched the platinum card back from the associate, loudly blaming a ridiculous banking error or a faulty security chip. She dug back into her purse and retrieved her secondary card, the gold business line of credit directly tied to my hardware company. She slapped it onto the marble counter, commanding the associate to run it immediately. The associate swiped the gold card. The machine processed for 3 agonizing seconds before emitting the exact same harsh, rejecting tone. Declined. The blood rushed to Megan's face, painting her cheeks a furious, humiliated shade of crimson. 2 other wealthy patrons standing nearby turned their heads to look at the commotion, their eyes filled with quiet, devastating judgment. Megan felt the crushing weight of sudden public embarrassment. She was entirely stripped of her manufactured high society armor. She grabbed her cards, shoved them back into her purse, and loudly accused the boutique of having a defective payment system. She spun around and marched out of the store, leaving the beautiful leather handbags and the silk coat sitting abandoned on the counter. The moment the heavy glass doors closed behind her, she pulled out her cellular phone and frantically dialed her husband. Her hands were shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. 30 miles away, Bradley was sitting comfortably behind the massive mahogany desk in his leased corporate office. He was admiring the sweeping view of the city skyline, feeling incredibly confident about his morning. He genuinely believed his emergency probate court petition was a flawless masterpiece of legal strategy. He answered his phone with a smug, relaxed greeting. Megan did not offer a greeting in return. She immediately unleashed a torrent of shrill, panicked complaints. She screamed about the humiliating ordeal at the boutique, demanding to know why her premium credit cards were suddenly bouncing like worthless checks. She ordered Bradley to log into the bank and authorize a manual override immediately so she could go back inside and retrieve her purchases. Bradley rolled his eyes, assuming his wife had simply hit a standard daily spending limit. He calmly opened his laptop, placed the phone on speaker, and navigated to the primary commercial banking portal for the family hardware enterprise. He confidently typed in his administrative username and his secure password. He reached for his coffee mug, fully expecting to see the familiar dashboard of stolen corporate wealth. He pressed the enter key. The screen did not load the financial dashboard. Instead, the entire monitor flashed a stark, aggressive shade of solid red. A thick white warning banner appeared across the center of the display. Access entirely denied. All corporate accounts permanently suspended pending active federal fraud review. Bradley dropped his ceramic coffee mug. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending hot, dark liquid splashing across his expensive leather shoes. He stared at the glowing red screen in absolute paralyzing horror. The words "Federal Fraud Review" echoed in his mind like a death sentence. He frantically clicked the refresh button, praying it was a simple digital glitch. The red screen remained frozen, completely unyielding. He typed the web address for his secondary business credit lines, the accounts he used to float his failing personal investments. Every single login attempt was met with the exact same terrifying red banner. The financial arteries were completely severed. He was locked out of everything. The reality of their disastrous situation began to crash down upon them with the force of a collapsing dam. Bradley grabbed the phone, his smug confidence entirely vaporized. He told Megan to stop screaming and listen to him carefully. He explained that the corporate accounts were not just overdrawn. They were frozen by federal banking investigators. Paranoia instantly gripped them both. Bradley frantically dialed the bank's elite corporate client hotline. After 30 agonizing minutes of listening to cheerful hold music, a cold, unfeeling automated voice informed him that a specialized compliance team had flagged multiple highly irregular wire transfers. The automated system specifically listed the routing numbers associated with his carefully constructed ghost vendors. Apex Industrial Solutions and the fake marketing firms were completely exposed and legally locked. When Bradley finally reached a human representative and demanded an explanation, the agent coldly refused to provide any further details, cited an active criminal investigation protocol, and abruptly hung up the phone. The walls were rapidly closing in around them. Megan paced frantically down the city sidewalk, demanding to know how they were going to pay the massive mortgage on their sprawling suburban mansion, which was due on the 1st of the month. Bradley opened his personal banking application on his phone to check his private checking account. The balance was terrifyingly low. They had always relied entirely on siphoning the corporate accounts to pay off their exorbitant personal credit card bills. Their personal cards were already maxed out to their absolute limits. They had absolutely no liquid cash reserves. They were bleeding money from every single pore entirely severed from the stolen wealth that funded their false reality. They were completely broke, and they had absolutely no way to stop the financial hemorrhage. Yet the most beautiful, satisfying part of their entire panic was their absolute blindness. Their staggering arrogance completely shielded them from the truth. As they frantically argued over the phone, desperate to find a solution, they never once connected the federal banking freeze to my master plan. They assumed a highly sophisticated bank algorithm had finally detected their sloppy accounting practices. They assumed an anonymous corporate whistleblower had tipped off the Internal Revenue Service. They believed this was a tragic, terrible coincidence. They never suspected the quiet elderly man they were currently trying to lock inside a psychiatric ward. In their panicked minds, I was just a sad, relapsed alcoholic suffering from severe dementia, completely unaware of the world around me. They genuinely believed that if they could just push the emergency guardianship petition through the probate court and seize total legal control of my estate, they could somehow use my clean personal funds to override the banking freeze and save themselves from federal prison. They were sprinting directly into the final trap, driven entirely by their own insatiable greed and blind desperation. I left the thick stack of emergency guardianship papers resting on the glass coffee table in my living room. I did not throw them in the trash, nor did I burn them. They were physical proof of his perjury, and I would need them later. I walked slowly down the long hallway toward my home office, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark orange shadows across the hardwood floorboards. The financial lockdown I had initiated earlier that morning had clearly pushed them to the absolute brink of panic, prompting their vicious legal strike. Now it was time to release the pressure valve just enough to lure them out of their defensive posture. It was time to give my son exactly what he thought he wanted. I sat heavily behind my large oak desk and powered on my desktop computer. The bright monitor illuminated the dim room. I opened my personal email application and opened a blank composition window. I typed Bradley's private email address into the recipient line. I leaned back in my leather chair, interlaced my fingers, and took a deep centering breath. I needed to completely suppress my anger, my pride, and my cold calculation. I needed to channel the exact pathetic persona he had maliciously described in his fraudulent court documents. I needed to become the defeated, broken, and terrified old man he firmly believed me to be. I placed my fingers on the keyboard and began to type. Every single word was meticulously chosen to feed his massive, incredibly fragile ego. I did not use the formal, commanding tone I usually employed for our business correspondence. I used the desperate, pleading voice of a father who had finally been crushed by the unbearable weight of his own failures. I began the email by acknowledging the receipt of the probate court summons. I told him that reading those aggressive legal documents had physically and mentally destroyed me. I lied with absolute unwavering conviction. I wrote that the sheer shock and profound heartbreak of his betrayal had triggered a severe, agonizing angina attack. I claimed I had spent the entire afternoon sitting on the floor, clutching my chest in absolute agony, terrified that my failing heart was finally giving out under the immense pressure. I told him my cardiologist had explicitly warned me that the extreme stress of a public, humiliating courtroom battle would undoubtedly be fatal. I let the pathetic narrative breathe, ensuring every sentence dripped with submission. I moved to the next paragraph, focusing entirely on an unconditional surrender. I typed that I was simply too old, too sick, and too deeply exhausted to fight my own flesh and blood anymore. I told him that if total control of the estate was what he truly desired, he had decisively won the war. I offered to completely and voluntarily surrender my position as the sole trustee of Patricia's irrevocable trust. I offered to sign over total executive control of the family hardware business, including all voting shares, and transfer all liquid assets directly into his name. I painted it as the final desperate concession of a dying man who just wanted the emotional pain to stop. I told him I was ready to hand him the keys to the entire kingdom without another word of protest. I added one final crucial condition to make the bait completely irresistible to a cornered animal. I wrote that I would sign all the transfer documents immediately provided he formally withdraw the emergency guardianship petition the moment the ink was dry. I begged him not to force me into a locked psychiatric facility. I pleaded for the basic human dignity to live out my final quiet days in peace without the unbearable shame and public spectacle of a competency trial. I ended the email not with my formal legal signature, but simply with the word "Dad." I read the entire message twice from top to bottom. It was a flawless masterpiece of manufactured despair. It was the exact validation his malignant narcissism desperately craved. I moved my mouse and clicked the send button. The digital message vanished into the ether, carrying the final lethal trap directly to his inbox. 30 miles away, the atmosphere inside Bradley and Megan's leased suburban mansion was thick with sheer panic and bitter mutual recrimination. They were still reeling from the catastrophic freezing of their corporate banking accounts. Megan was pacing the expensive hardwood floor of their kitchen, aggressively demanding immediate solutions to their sudden poverty. Bradley was sitting at the granite counter, his head in his hands, frantically searching his mind for a way to untangle the federal fraud review before the authorities arrived at his door. Then the sharp, distinct chime of an incoming electronic message echoed from Bradley's cellular phone. He snatched the device, his bloodshot eyes scanning the notification screen. When he saw my name listed as the sender, he hastily swiped the screen to open the message. He read the email in absolute breathless silence. As his eyes tracked across the paragraphs of my manufactured surrender, his physical posture completely transformed. The slumped, terrified shoulders of a man facing imminent federal prison were instantly replaced by the arrogant, puffed-up stance of a victorious conqueror. A slow, incredibly cruel smile spread across his face. He let out a loud, triumphant bark of laughter that startled his wife. He called Megan over to the counter, shoved the cellular phone into her hands, and ordered her to read my message. Megan snatched the device and quickly absorbed my pathetic, pleading words. The deep public humiliation she had suffered at the luxury boutique earlier that afternoon vanished instantly from her mind. She looked up at her husband, her eyes gleaming with pure, unadulterated greed and vicious satisfaction. They did not feel a single ounce of guilt or basic human compassion for my supposed failing heart. They did not care that I claimed to be sitting alone in physical agony. They only saw the immediate total capitulation of their enemy. They openly celebrated my pain. Bradley loudly mocked my weakness, declaring to his wife that the extreme pressure of the probate court petition was a stroke of absolute tactical genius. He bragged that he had finally broken my stubborn, outdated spirit and forced me to face the reality of his superiority. Megan immediately began calculating how fast they could liquidate the hardware company's remaining physical inventory to unfreeze their frozen cash flow. They genuinely and foolishly believed my voluntary surrender would automatically override the federal banking freeze. They were completely blinded by the glittering, intoxicating illusion of an immediate $4 million payout. Bradley did not wait long to reply. He wanted to secure the absolute victory before I could supposedly regain my strength or change my mind. My desktop computer chimed with his response less than 20 minutes later. His email was dripping with false magnanimity and poorly concealed desperate eagerness. He wrote that he was incredibly relieved I had finally come to my senses and accepted my own limitations. He formally agreed to withdraw the guardianship petition, blatantly lying, by claiming he never actually wanted to put me in a psychiatric facility, but simply needed me to recognize my own medical incompetence. He demanded we execute the legal transfer immediately aggressively, suggesting we meet first thing the very next morning to finalize the paperwork. I replied instantly, setting the precise physical stage for his absolute destruction. I told him my house was too cluttered, and my attorney's downtown office was far too intimidating for my current fragile state. I insisted we meet at the main boardroom of the hardware company headquarters at exactly 10 o'clock the following morning. I told him it was only fitting to hand over the family legacy in the exact room where Patricia and I had built it. I instructed him to bring the necessary surrender documents and his own legal counsel to ensure everything was handled quickly, legally, and quietly. Bradley agreed to the terms without a single moment of hesitation or suspicion. He thought I was simply choosing a nostalgic, sentimental location for my final, humiliating defeat. He did not realize I had specifically chosen the corporate boardroom because it possessed heavy, solid oak doors, completely soundproof walls, and absolutely no secondary exits. The meeting was set in stone. The bait had been completely swallowed. They were walking straight into the slaughterhouse, entirely convinced they were arriving at a coronation. The morning sun had barely crested the city skyline when I pulled my vehicle into the secure underground parking garage of the federal building downtown. I did not wear the faded flannel shirt and work boots from the lake. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. I dressed for a funeral, but it was certainly not going to be mine. I carried a heavy black leather briefcase containing the absolute destruction of my only son. I bypassed the main public entrance and walked directly to the restricted side elevators. Detective Reynolds was waiting for me in the lobby. He was a seasoned veteran of the police force, a man whose career I had quietly helped salvage many years ago during a difficult departmental inquiry. He possessed a grim, unwavering sense of justice, and he knew I would never call him for a trivial family dispute. We shook hands in complete silence. He swiped his security badge and escorted me up to the 8th floor, leading me through a labyrinth of sterile hallways until we reached a secure, windowless conference room. Waiting inside the room was a senior federal investigator from the White-Collar Crime Division. I will refer to him simply as Agent Thompson. He was a sharp, highly analytical man who did not suffer fools or waste time on baseless accusations. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the center of the metal table and snapped the brass locks open. I did not offer them a long emotional story about a broken family. I am a businessman, and I presented them with a flawless corporate presentation of absolute criminality. I extracted the thick manila folders one by one and slid them across the cold metal surface. I started with the financial hemorrhage. I handed Agent Thompson the complete forensic accounting dossier meticulously prepared by Wallace. I watched the federal agent open the file and scan the executive summary. The evidence of federal wire fraud was completely undeniable. The documents clearly mapped out the creation of the fictitious ghost vendors. They tracked the unauthorized electronic transfer of $314,000 from my corporate operating accounts directly across state lines into Bradley's personal banking network. I provided the exact dates, the specific routing numbers, and the digital login credentials my son had used to authorize every single fraudulent transaction. Agent Thompson traced the flow of stolen money directly to Megan's luxury automobile leases, their extravagant European vacations, and their exorbitant personal credit card payments. He noted the precise timestamps of the transfers, proving they were executed late at night to avoid immediate detection by my regular accounting staff. It was a textbook case of massive corporate embezzlement, fully documented, flawlessly categorized, and neatly packaged with a pristine bow. Then I escalated the situation from severe financial theft to cold-blooded attempted murder. I reached back into my briefcase and produced the sealed evidence bag containing the heavily tampered bottle of imported Russian vodka. I placed it gently on the table next to the financial audit. Beside the bottle, I placed the official toxicology report from the private independent laboratory. I instructed Detective Reynolds to read the chemical analysis aloud. He picked up the document and read the staggering concentration levels of warfarin dissolved inside the clear liquid. I explained my daily prescribed dosage of the exact same blood-thinning medication. I explained the fatal untraceable internal hemorrhage that would have occurred if I had consumed even a single ounce of the tainted liquor on my birthday. I described how the massive dose would have stripped my blood of its ability to clot, turning a minor bruise into a lethal event, and how a full glass would have killed me in my sleep without a single warning pain. I then presented the handwritten birthday card Bradley had included with the lethal gift, openly mocking my 12 years of sobriety and encouraging me to drink the poison. To completely seal the trap, I handed them the emergency guardianship petition Bradley had filed in the probate court just yesterday. I pointed out his sworn affidavit, claiming I had recently purchased vodka and suffered a severe alcoholic relapse. I showed them the falsified retail receipt he had attached as physical proof. I explained that this legal document was his incredibly arrogant attempt to silence me and seize total control of my estate before I could uncover his massive financial crimes. I told them he had committed blatant perjury to facilitate a murder plot. The two men sat in absolute stunned silence. Law enforcement officers are accustomed to dealing with chaotic, sloppy criminals who leave trails of confusing evidence. They were not accustomed to a victim walking into their office and handing them a fully investigated, airtight federal prosecution on a silver platter. I sat back in my chair and looked at the two men. I told them the evidence was absolute and the motive was perfectly clear. I asked them if they had enough to proceed. Agent Thompson closed the forensic accounting file and looked directly at me. He stated that they had more than enough evidence to secure an immediate federal indictment for multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy. Detective Reynolds added that the tampered bottle and the falsified court documents provided overwhelming probable cause for state charges of premeditated attempted murder and severe elder abuse. The machinery of the justice system, usually slow and incredibly bureaucratic, suddenly engaged with terrifying speed. The sheer volume of the stolen funds across state lines, combined with the extreme calculated lethality of the poison, demanded an immediate and overwhelming response. The agents recognized that the perpetrators were desperate, cornered, and highly dangerous now that their money was gone. Agent Thompson picked up the secure telephone on the conference table and contacted an on-call federal magistrate judge. He summarized the forensic evidence, the active financial freeze currently trapping the suspects, and the immediate flight risk they posed now that their accounts were locked. The judge did not hesitate. Within 30 minutes, a secure digital fax machine in the corner of the room whirred to life. It began printing out a thick stack of authorized documents. I watched the pages fall into the plastic tray. They were federal arrest warrants for Bradley and Megan, alongside comprehensive search warrants for their leased suburban mansion and their personal vehicles. The legal authorization for their total destruction was officially signed and stamped. Detective Reynolds grabbed his radio and began coordinating with the local tactical units to execute the warrants at their residence. I immediately raised my hand and stopped him. I told them I did not want my son arrested in the quiet privacy of his own home. I did not want him dragged out of bed in the middle of the night, where no one could see his humiliation. I wanted his arrest to be a monumental, inescapable public spectacle that shattered his arrogance at its absolute peak. I wanted him to feel the exact moment his entire reality collapsed. I explained the trap I had carefully laid out the previous evening. I told them about the pathetic, pleading email I had sent and the meeting I had scheduled for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning in the main boardroom of my hardware company headquarters. I explained that Bradley and his arrogant lawyer would be walking into that room absolutely convinced they had broken my spirit and won the war. They would be expecting me to sign over total executive control of a $4 million empire. I told the federal agent and the detective that I wanted the arrest to happen exactly there in that specific room right at the moment he reached across the table to claim his unearned crown. I wanted him to fall from the highest possible altitude. Agent Thompson looked at Detective Reynolds, a faint smile of professional respect crossing his stoic face. They agreed to my highly specific terms. We spent the next hour coordinating the exact tactical movements. Federal marshals would secure the perimeter of the corporate building. Plainclothes officers would take positions in the lobby. Detective Reynolds and a heavily armed team of federal agents would stage themselves in the empty offices immediately adjacent to the boardroom, waiting for my precise signal to breach the heavy oak doors. I left the federal building and drove slowly back to my empty house. The sun was shining brightly, completely at odds with the dark, violent justice I had just orchestrated. I unlocked my front door, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself a tall glass of cold iced tea. The house was perfectly silent. I walked into my home office, sat in my leather chair, and simply breathed. There was absolutely nothing left to do. The financial accounts were entirely frozen. The lakeside property was legally sold for cash. The lethal physical evidence was perfectly secured. The federal warrants were signed and waiting. The trap was perfectly set, and the bait had been entirely swallowed. Tomorrow morning, the quiet, underestimated father they tried to casually discard would become the architect of their absolute ruin. I closed my eyes and waited for the dawn. The heavy oak doors of the corporate boardroom remained tightly closed. I sat alone at the far end of the massive mahogany table, occupying the exact seat where my late wife Patricia and I had negotiated the initial expansion of our hardware empire over 3 decades ago. The room was specifically designed for absolute discretion and undeniable corporate power. The walls were lined with thick, soundproof acoustic paneling. There were no secondary exits, only the primary double doors leading directly into the main executive reception area. I adjusted my tailored charcoal suit jacket and placed my hands flat on the polished wood surface. I did not bring a pen to this meeting. I did not bring a notepad or a glass of water. I only brought the heavy black leather briefcase currently resting securely near my leather boots. The digital clock on the far wall clicked to exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. The trap was fully primed and the target was approaching. Right on schedule, the heavy brass handles turned and the double doors swung open. Bradley walked into the room first. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit that he undoubtedly purchased with my stolen corporate funds. His physical posture was completely transformed from the terrified, stammering coward I had spoken to on the phone just 48 hours prior. He walked with the exaggerated, puffed-up confidence of a man who firmly believed he had entirely outsmarted his greatest adversary. Megan followed closely behind him. She was carrying a completely new designer leather handbag, likely purchased on credit the moment she believed my $4 million estate was securely within her grasp. Her face was set in a tight, condescending smirk. She looked around the wood-paneled boardroom with blatant hunger already visually measuring the prestigious space for her own future redesigns. Following the two of them was a man I did not immediately recognize, but his professional type was glaringly obvious. He wore an expensive gray pinstripe suit and carried a sleek silver briefcase. He possessed the slick, overly manicured appearance of a high-priced defense attorney who specialized in aggressive corporate takeovers. He walked with a distinct air of superiority, entirely convinced he was entering a room to bully a senile, defeated old man into a rapid, unconditional surrender. Bradley did not offer a polite morning greeting. He did not ask about my supposedly failing heart or the severe angina attack I had detailed in my pathetic email. He simply gestured for his wife and his lawyer to take their seats on the opposite side of the massive table. They arranged themselves efficiently, sitting shoulder to shoulder, like a tribunal preparing to pass ultimate judgment on a convicted criminal. Bradley remained standing at the head of the table, deliberately choosing the position of maximum physical authority. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and placed his hands on the polished wood, leaning forward to project absolute dominance. The slick lawyer snapped his silver briefcase open and extracted a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He handed the papers directly to Bradley. Bradley held the documents for a long moment, intentionally letting the heavy silence stretch across the soundproof room. He wanted me to feel the crushing weight of my impending defeat. He wanted me to marinate in the absolute humiliation of surrendering my life's work. He looked at me, his eyes completely devoid of any familial warmth or basic human empathy. He slid the thick stack of surrender documents across the smooth mahogany surface. The papers glided effortlessly and came to a stop exactly 2 inches from my resting hands. Attached to the top page was a small yellow sticky note indicating exactly where I needed to sign my name to legally forfeit everything I owned. I looked down at the documents, keeping my facial expression entirely blank. I let my shoulders slump forward slightly, physically feeding his immense, fragile ego. I needed him to reach the absolute pinnacle of his arrogance before I triggered the demolition. Bradley took a deep breath and launched into his prepared speech. It was a sickening, beautifully crafted monologue of false benevolence. He spoke to me in the slow, overly enunciated tone one might use when addressing a confused, misbehaving child. He told me that this was the hardest decision he had ever been forced to make, but that it was entirely necessary for the preservation of the family legacy. He claimed he had spent the last 2 days agonizing over my deteriorating mental and physical condition. He boldly stated that my tragic relapse into severe alcoholism proved I was no longer capable of managing a complex corporate enterprise. Megan nodded along in perfect choreographed agreement, her face a mask of manufactured sorrowful pity. Bradley continued his vicious performance. He told me that Patricia would be utterly devastated to see how far I had fallen maliciously, using his dead mother as a psychological weapon to twist the knife deeper into my chest. He stated that the hardware business required young, dynamic leadership to survive in the modern economy, and that my outdated, stubborn methods were actively driving the company toward absolute ruin. He painted himself as the reluctant savior stepping in at the final hour to rescue the family wealth from my destructive, drunken incompetence. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the legal documents resting in front of me. He explained that these papers would grant him immediate total executive control of the business and completely sever my legal authority as the primary trustee. He promised that in exchange for my quiet, undisputed signature, he would gracefully withdraw his emergency guardianship petition from the probate court. He generously offered to let me keep living in the main house provided I accept a modest monthly allowance and submit to random medical wellness checks administered by his chosen physicians. He framed my absolute subjugation as an act of profound, generous mercy. He finished his speech by demanding I pick up the pen and do the right thing for my own good. He told me to stop fighting, accept my failures, and step aside with whatever tiny shred of dignity I had left. The arrogant lawyer crossed his arms, tapping his expensive pen against the table, waiting impatiently for my total capitulation. Megan let out a soft, highly theatrical sigh of relief, fully believing the terrible ordeal of dealing with me was finally over. The illusion of their total victory was absolutely flawless. They had built a massive, glittering tower of lies, and they were currently standing on the very top floor, completely blind to the fact that I had already rigged the entire foundation with high explosives. I did not reach for the pen. I simply looked up from the fraudulent documents and stared directly into my son's greedy, expecting eyes. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not break eye contact with my son. The silence in the soundproof boardroom became incredibly thick and uncomfortable. Bradley shifted his weight, his confident posture faltering as the seconds ticked by without my expected submission. The arrogant lawyer cleared his throat, tapping his index finger aggressively against the mahogany table, demanding that I apply my signature immediately. He warned me that stalling would only prolong my humiliation and significantly complicate the court proceedings. Megan let out a loud sigh, muttering about my endless stubbornness and how I always made everything difficult. I ignored their noise completely. I slowly reached down and lifted my heavy black leather briefcase, placing it squarely on top of their fraudulent surrender documents. The brass locks clicked loudly as I snapped them open. The sharp sound echoed like a physical strike. I reached inside the dark interior. I did not pull out a pen or a pathetic medical evaluation. I pulled out 3 thick, sealed manila folders. I placed the heavy folders in a deliberate stack. I picked up the top folder and slid it smoothly across the wooden table. It stopped directly in front of the lawyer. I looked at the man in the pinstripe suit and spoke with a voice entirely devoid of emotion. I commanded him to open the folder and read the top document aloud to his clients. The lawyer scoffed, attempting to maintain his superior facade, but his professional curiosity won. He opened the cover and scanned the first page. His arrogant sneer instantly vanished, replaced by a deep furrow of unadulterated confusion. He hesitated, looking up at me with wide eyes. I ordered him again, my voice echoing coldly, to read the title of the document out loud. He swallowed hard and read the words. It was the finalized state-certified cash sale deed for the lakeside property. I watched Megan's face rapidly drain of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. The lawyer read the officially recorded date. The real estate transaction had completely closed the previous afternoon. The massive sum of money was already resting securely in my offshore escrow account. I looked directly at Megan. I told her the commercial bulldozers were scheduled to arrive at the lake tomorrow morning to violently tear down her white pavilion. I informed her she was currently advertising a luxury wellness retreat on land legally owned by a massive corporate developer, and she would face devastating civil lawsuits from every single wealthy client she had defrauded. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her manufactured kingdom was entirely obliterated. Before the shock could settle into their trembling bones, I picked up the second manila folder and slid it forcefully across the table. It hit the lawyer's briefcase with a dull thud. I instructed him to open it and read the bolded executive summary. The lawyer's hands were trembling visibly now. He flipped the cover open, and his eyes widened in sheer panic. He was no longer looking at a surprising real estate transaction. He was looking at a meticulously documented federal crime. He began to read, his voice cracking under the immense weight of the legal words. He read the names of the fictitious ghost vendors. He read the exact bank routing numbers and the specific digital timestamps. He read the final stolen sum of $314,000. Bradley let out a choked, terrified gasp, violently pushing his chair back. The terrifying reality of the frozen corporate banking accounts suddenly made perfect sense to his panicked mind. This was not a random automated error. This was a targeted forensic demolition. I looked directly at my son. I told him that I had hired a retired federal investigator to track every stolen dollar directly to his sprawling mansion and his wife's imported vehicles. I told him the bank had locked his accounts because my investigator provided them with undeniable proof of massive corporate embezzlement. The legal trap he thought he was setting for me was a childish illusion. He was entirely bankrupt, deeply in debt, and completely exposed. The final blow remained. I picked up the third and thickest manila folder. I held it firmly in my hand, feeling the absolute gravity of its dark contents. I looked at the slick corporate defense attorney. He was sweating profusely now, violently realizing he had been completely manipulated into facilitating a massive criminal conspiracy. I tossed the heavy folder onto the table. I commanded the lawyer to read the final document. He opened the file with extreme reluctance. His eyes scanned the official laboratory letterhead. It was the certified toxicology report from the private independent testing facility. He read the chemical name warfarin out loud, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. He read the staggering lethal concentration levels found inside the clear liquid of the imported Russian vodka. He turned with shaking hands to the secondary page which detailed the forensic fingerprint analysis. The laboratory had successfully lifted an unbroken thumbprint from the underside of the tampered factory seal completely encased in the fraudulent adhesive. The thumbprint belonged undeniably to Bradley. I stood up slowly from my leather chair, towering over the opposite end of the mahogany table. I spoke with freezing, absolute finality. I told them that the birthday gift was not just a violation of a trust morality clause. It was a calculated, cold-blooded, premeditated act of attempted murder. I explained that the massive dose of blood thinners would have instantly reacted with my heart medication, causing a fatal internal hemorrhage while I slept. I told the terrified lawyer that his client had deliberately submitted a falsified retail receipt to a probate judge just yesterday to cover up a failed assassination plot. The reversal was absolute and utterly complete. The slick corporate defense attorney did not say a single word for what felt like an absolute eternity. He simply stared at the certified laboratory documents resting on the polished mahogany table. The color completely drained from his perfectly tanned face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. He was a man who made his extremely lucrative living navigating complex gray areas and exploiting corporate legal loopholes, but there was absolutely no gray area in a fingerprint-matched toxicology report for a lethal dose of blood thinners. He slowly and agonizingly realized the catastrophic magnitude of the situation he was currently sitting in. Just yesterday afternoon, he had walked directly into a county courthouse and officially filed an emergency guardianship petition under his own pristine Bar Association license. He had unknowingly attached a completely falsified retail receipt to a sworn legal affidavit. He had legally represented a man who was actively trying to cover up a premeditated assassination attempt against his own father. The lawyer knew exactly how the aggressive federal justice system operated. He knew that the authorities would look at that fraudulent probate filing and immediately see him as a willing, active co-conspirator to attempted homicide and massive financial embezzlement. His breathing became incredibly rapid and shallow. His eyes darted frantically around the soundproof boardroom, suddenly viewing the luxurious corporate space as a highly secure federal trap. He looked at Bradley, who was currently hyperventilating in his leather executive chair, and then he looked directly at me. I maintained my cold, unyielding stare, offering absolutely no comfort or reassurance. The lawyer did not try to defend his terrible client. He did not attempt to argue the validity of the forensic chemical evidence or even ask for a brief moment of private consultation. He operated purely on raw, unfiltered, professional survival instinct. He violently shoved his chair back from the table. The heavy wooden chair scraped loudly and aggressively across the floor. He reached out with shaking hands and aggressively shoved the manila folders back toward Bradley as if the paper itself were contaminated with a deadly, contagious virus. He stated in a loud, trembling voice that he was formally and immediately recusing himself as legal counsel. He declared to the entire room that he had been maliciously lied to, completely manipulated, and fraudulently used to file perjured court documents. He practically shouted that he was severing all attorney and client privileges regarding this specific matter due to the active commission of a severe felony. He did not wait for Bradley to respond or for Megan to object to his sudden departure. He frantically grabbed his silver briefcase from the table, not even bothering to gather the thick surrender documents he had brought. He snapped the metal latches shut, turned his back on the completely doomed couple, and practically sprinted toward the heavy oak doors. He grabbed the brass handles, yanked the doors open, and fled the room without looking back. Absolutely desperate to call the State Bar Association and save his own lucrative license from total destruction. The heavy oak doors did not swing completely shut after the terrified lawyer made his frantic, cowardly escape. They remained slightly ajar, hovering in the tense, silent air for exactly 3 agonizing seconds. Bradley sat entirely frozen in his chair, his eyes wide with absolute paralyzing terror. He stared blankly at the empty space where his highly paid legal protection had been sitting just moments before. He was entirely alone now, completely stripped of his arrogant facade, his stolen corporate wealth, and his slick legal defense. Megan was openly weeping, her face buried deep in her trembling hands. her brand-new designer handbag sitting uselessly on the table beside the devastating, undeniable evidence of their complete ruin. Bradley slowly turned his head to look at me, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. He finally understood the absolute terrifying depth of the dark abyss he had proudly marched into. He finally realized that the pathetic, broken, defeated old man he thought he was easily conquering was actually the ruthless architect of his total annihilation. Before he could form a single pathetic word of apology or desperately beg for a mercy, he absolutely did not deserve. The heavy oak doors were violently pushed wide open. The polished brass handles slammed incredibly hard against the expensive acoustic wall paneling. The sudden violent noise echoed like a gunshot in the quiet soundproof room. Detective Reynolds stepped through the doorway first. He was no longer the quiet, polite observer from the federal building lobby. He was a seasoned, hardened law enforcement officer, officially executing a highly dangerous arrest warrant. He stepped into the room with absolute unyielding authority, his hand resting securely on his utility belt. Directly behind him filed 3 heavily armed federal marshals wearing dark tactical vests, emblazoned with bold yellow letters. The heavy rhythmic sound of their thick tactical boots marching aggressively across the corporate carpet signaled the undeniable brutal end of the silent adjustment. The marshals instantly fanned out across the large room, securing the perimeter and physically blocking any possible avenue of escape. Detective Reynolds walked deliberately and purposefully toward the center of the mahogany table. He did not look at me. He kept his stern eyes locked firmly on my son's terrified face. He reached into his dark suit jacket pocket and pulled out the thick stack of authorized federal and state warrants we had secured just an hour ago. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from Bradley's trembling form. The air in the room grew incredibly cold and heavy. The beautiful illusion of the corporate takeover was completely and permanently shattered, replaced entirely by the harsh, unforgiving reality of the criminal justice system. Detective Reynolds held up the legal documents and spoke with a loud, commanding voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation, debate, or argument. He stated my son's full legal name and announced to the entire room that he was officially under arrest for multiple federal counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, perjury, and the premeditated attempted murder of his own father. The ultimate trap had completely snapped shut. The 2 federal marshals did not hesitate for a single second after Detective Reynolds made the official declaration. They moved across the polished mahogany floor with the terrifying synchronized efficiency of highly trained predators closing in on a cornered animal. Bradley tried to stumble backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the thick corporate carpet. His back hit the acoustic wall paneling with a heavy hollow thud. He raised his hands defensively, his mouth still opening and closing in a desperate, silent panic. The lead marshal grabbed Bradley by his tailored navy blue shoulder and spun him violently around. The physical force of the maneuver slammed Bradley face first against the soundproof wall. His cheek pressed hard against the expensive fabric. The marshal kicked Bradley's legs apart, completely neutralizing his balance, and pinned his back with a heavy forearm. The sharp, unmistakable sound of steel ratchets clicking echoed loudly through the silent boardroom. The cold, heavy metal cuffs were locked tightly around his wrists, biting deeply into his skin. Detective Reynolds stepped forward, pulling a small printed card from his breast pocket. He began reading the Miranda rights in a loud, monotonous voice that completely stripped the moment of any remaining humanity. He informed my son that he had the right to remain silent, a right he should have exercised long before he decided to forge a medical document and tamper with a factory seal. Bradley did not seem to hear the legal warnings. He was thrashing weakly against the wall, hyperventilating so hard his entire body visibly shook. The marshals pulled him away from the wall and forced him to turn around. His perfectly tailored suit was rumpled and twisted. His expensive silk tie hung crookedly around his neck. The arrogant, victorious conqueror who had marched into this room just 20 minutes ago was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified criminal who finally understood the absolute permanence of his actions. Bradley locked his bloodshot, terrified eyes onto mine. The manufactured corporate confidence was completely stripped away, revealing the pathetic, greedy child hiding underneath. He began to beg. He did not ask for his lawyer to return. He did not demand to see the forensic evidence again. He simply begged me to save him from the nightmare he had meticulously created. He pleaded with me, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. He cried out that I was his father. He yelled that family does not do this to family. He begged me to tell the federal agents that this was all just a terrible, massive misunderstanding. He swore on his late mother's grave that he never actually intended to hurt me wildly, claiming the poisoned vodka was just a stupid, thoughtless mistake. He pleaded for me to withdraw the criminal charges, promising he would sign the business back over immediately, promising he would move away, promising he would do absolutely anything if I just told the armed men to take the handcuffs off. I remained seated calmly at the head of the heavy mahogany table. I did not stand up to comfort him. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic screaming. I did not offer a dramatic, triumphant speech outlining his failures. I simply looked at him. I looked right through his tear-streaked face, right through his pathetic apologies, and right through the fading illusion of the son I once thought I had. The absolute silence I offered him was far more devastating than any physical blow I could have ever delivered. It was the complete final withdrawal of my paternal protection. I was no longer his father, and he was no longer my heir. He was simply a dangerous parasite that I had successfully and surgically extracted from my life. My unwavering stare confirmed his worst fear. There would be absolutely no mercy. There would be no second chances. The silent adjustment was completely permanent. While Bradley was rapidly breaking down into a sobbing, pathetic mess, Megan slowly began to back away toward the heavy oak doors. She was pressing her back tightly against the wall, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. Her eyes were darting frantically between the armed marshals and the certified toxicology report sitting untouched on the table. She raised her trembling hands, her brand-new designer handbag completely forgotten. She desperately attempted to save herself by instantly betraying the man she had sworn to love. She shrieked that she had absolutely no idea about the poison. She loudly declared that Bradley handled all the gifts and that she would never participate in a murder plot. She screamed that she was just an innocent wife who foolishly trusted her husband's financial decisions. Agent Thompson stepped out from the hallway and entered the boardroom, completely blocking her final path of escape. He looked at Megan with absolute freezing contempt. He smoothly informed her that while she may not have crushed the blood-thinning pills into the alcohol, the federal government had undeniable forensic proof of her deep financial complicity. He told her she was a legally registered, authorized user on the corporate accounts used to execute the massive embezzlement. He informed her that her signature was physically recorded on the luxury vehicle lease agreements and the expensive vacation bookings directly funded by stolen corporate wire transfers. He stated clearly that under strict federal law, willingly spending hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen corporate money made her an active, highly culpable co-conspirator to massive financial fraud. Agent Thompson nodded to the third federal marshal standing near the doorway. The marshal stepped forward, grabbed Megan by her trembling arms, and forcefully spun her around. Megan let out a piercing, hysterical scream as her wrists were violently pulled behind her back. The second set of heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut. Her knees completely buckled, and the marshal had to physically hold her upright to prevent her from collapsing onto the carpet. Her expensive makeup was ruined by a flood of terrified tears. The absolute destruction of their false reality was now fully complete. They had walked into my sanctuary, intending to strip me of everything I owned, and now they were being physically dragged out of it, completely stripped of their freedom, their stolen wealth, and their dignity. Detective Reynolds ordered the marshals to remove the prisoners from the premises. Bradley and Megan were forcefully marched out of the corporate boardroom, their wrists bound in steel, beginning the long, humiliating walk past the staring employees they had fully intended to fire. 6 months passed since the heavy oak doors of the corporate boardroom closed behind my son. The rapid, chaotic machinery of the federal justice system had thoroughly processed the remains of his shattered life. It was a cold, overcast Thursday morning when I walked into the sprawling federal courthouse downtown for the final sentencing hearing. I took a seat in the second row of the polished wooden gallery. I wore the exact same charcoal suit I had worn on the day of his arrest. The heavy double doors at the front of the courtroom opened, and 2 armed federal marshals escorted Bradley into the room. He was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, tailored executive who had confidently demanded my entire estate. He was wearing a standard, shapeless orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were securely shackled with heavy steel chains that rattled loudly with every slow, defeated step he took. His face was pale, hollow, and deeply lined with the sheer exhaustion of spending the last 6 months locked inside a maximum security holding facility. His expensive haircuts were gone, replaced by a rough, uneven shave. He sat heavily at the defense table, keeping his eyes firmly glued to the floor. His highly paid corporate lawyer was long gone, replaced by an overworked public defender who had strongly advised him to plead guilty to absolutely everything to avoid a life sentence. Megan was not in the courtroom. She had quickly turned state evidence against her own husband the moment the marshals placed her in the back of the transport vehicle. She had completely confessed to the financial embezzlement to save herself, accepting a 5-year sentence in a minimum security federal camp, completely penniless and entirely alone. The federal judge, a stern woman with absolutely no patience for white-collar criminals who attempt to murder their own parents, read the final verdict aloud. She outlined the staggering greed of the corporate wire fraud, the profound cruelty of the falsified probate court documents, and the absolute undeniable malice of the warfarin-laced vodka. She looked directly down at Bradley and delivered the final crushing blow. She sentenced him to 20 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary, strictly without the possibility of early parole. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sounding block, echoing through the cavernous room with absolute inescapable finality. Bradley flinched at the sharp noise. He slowly turned his head and looked back at me sitting in the gallery. His eyes were completely hollow, silently, begging for a final look of pity or a single tear of fatherly sorrow. I gave him absolutely nothing. My face remained a perfectly calm, unreadable mask of stone. I did not shed a single tear for the man in the orange jumpsuit. The son I had raised died the moment he sealed that poison inside the velvet box. I simply stood up from the wooden bench, turned my back on him, and walked completely out of the courtroom, leaving him behind forever. The final transition of my life was incredibly swift and profoundly peaceful. I did not return to the large, empty suburban house filled with the ghosts of a broken family. I sold the property within a month, transferring the massive profits directly into Patricia's secure trust. I officially stepped down from the daily operations of my hardware enterprise, promoting my loyal, hard-working general manager to the position of chief executive officer. I completely severed the heavy anchors of my past. I purchased a beautiful, modest townhouse in a quiet, incredibly safe neighborhood on the very edge of the city. The streets here were lined with ancient oak trees, and the neighbors respected each other's privacy. It is late afternoon now. I am sitting comfortably in a woven wicker chair on my new wooden front porch. The spring air is warm and carries the faint, sweet scent of blooming jasmine from the garden I planted last month. I am holding a tall, sweating glass of iced tea. The ice cubes clink softly against the glass as I take a slow, refreshing sip. I look out at the quiet street, watching the golden light of the setting sun wash over the manicured lawns. There is absolutely no anxiety tightening my chest. There are no frantic phone calls to answer, no financial disasters to desperately fix, and no toxic arrogance to quietly endure. The heavy, suffocating poison has been completely extracted from my life. The silent adjustment was a complete and absolute success. I successfully protected the $4 million legacy my late wife and I built with our own two hands. I ensured that the wealth we created through decades of honest, grueling labor would never be squandered by a greedy, murderous parasite. More importantly, I successfully protected my own dignity. I proved that an old man's silence is never a symptom of weakness, but a carefully measured accumulation of strength. I learned the hardest, most vital lesson a father can ever learn. True family is never defined by a shared bloodline or a legal birth certificate. True family is entirely defined by mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and a love that never demands your self-destruction. I take another sip of the cold iced tea and rest my head back against the chair. The 12-year sobriety medallion sits heavily and securely in my pocket, a constant reminder of the incredible battles I have fought and won. I survived my past demons, I survived a failing heart, and I survived the ultimate betrayal. The conflict is completely over. The natural order of my universe has been fully and permanently restored. As the sun finally dips below the horizon, casting the quiet neighborhood into a peaceful twilight, I close my eyes and simply listen to the gentle rustling of the leaves. I am completely safe. I am entirely free. The story ends here not with a chaotic tragedy, but with a quiet, absolute, and victorious peace. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that silence should never be mistaken for submission. Society insists that family is an unbreakable bond, but shared blood does not entitle anyone to your continuous destruction. When the people you love begin to view your patience as a weakness to be exploited, you must possess the courage to show them the devastating precision of your boundaries. Greed always blinds the arrogant, making them feel invincible right until the floor completely collapses beneath their feet. True peace is only found by severing the rotting branches so the tree can survive. If you have ever had to cut a toxic person from your own life to protect your peace, share your victory in the comments below and subscribe for more stories of absolute justice.